Good morning, everybody. So glad to see you this morning. Thanks for being here as we join together for Bible study. We're studying Rules to Live By. Actually, our little workbook is called More Rules to Live By, a second set of lessons by the same author. If you're looking at your study guide, we're on lesson 3, but if you don't have one, don't worry about that. You'll be able to follow along with us as we look at these scriptures this morning. Lesson 3, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. Now, like the others in this, I think in most of these that we've studied in this new workbook, they're not exactly biblical statements. I think we'll see that this conveys a truth that's kind of confirmed by Scripture, but that statement is not in the Bible. Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. If you've ever, and I'm pretty sure you've probably heard that statement before, if you've ever tried to find its origin, it's a little bit of questionable origin. It's very often credited to Abraham Lincoln. But there wasn't any recording of that statement until something like 1916 or 19-something, long after Lincoln was dead. So I don't know. I don't know if you could prove that Lincoln is the one that said it. I've also seen it accredited to Mark Twain. So I don't know. But it's a somewhat familiar statement. It's been around for quite a while. Again, not directly from the Bible, but the Bible does contains some statements that would lead you to believe that this is a true observation, at least. All right, so our author asks us to begin in Proverbs 17, verses 27 and 28. He that hath knowledge spareth his words, and a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. Even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted wise, and he that shutteth his lips is esteemed a man of understanding. So right there you see the concept is clearly there, right, of the more familiar quote. But that definitely expresses the concept. So the wise man says, if you have knowledge, you limit your words, you spare your words. Don't you think that you've been around people that just talk all the time and they don't convey much information because pretty clearly they don't know what they're talking about? But on the other hand, you've been around people that you thought, that guy is really smart, he's really wise, that guy's got some good sense about him, and he doesn't talk a lot. When he says something, you pay attention because it typically is valuable. But he's not one that's just running off at the mouth all the time. And that's the idea here. Notice that an excellent spirit, a man of understanding is of an excellent spirit. And so a man who has understanding, it's going to mean that he inwardly, he is right. You know, he has an excellent spirit about him. If you have understanding and you apply it, obviously, then you're going to be right and live right. And then the author asks, how can a fool be considered perceptive? Well, even a fool, when he holdeth his peace, is counted as wise. So that's the idea. You know, I don't know. I've been around that guy a time or two. I haven't really engaged him in conversation. I wouldn't be, he may be the smartest guy around. I just can't judge him because he didn't say much. So even a person who doesn't have great understanding, if he's perceptive enough to be still, he can be counted as wise. So again, I think that statement there in Proverbs 17 comes really, really close, of course, to the more famous quote that is the title of our lesson today. Thoughts or comments? I think that this sort of conveys a common experience that all of us have probably had. I think it's pretty easy to relate to that. Paul?
When you introduced the topic, the first thing that came to my mind was we're sort of divided today. That you can have people on two sides of one particular issue.
Yeah. Yeah.
So both of them think they're absolutely right, and the other one's an absolute idiot.
Yeah.
And what do you do next?
I think a lot of that comes down to do they have understanding? You know, like this passage. A lot of the people who are very committed to some of their, especially political causes, I don't think they have a good understanding. You know, maybe when it comes to economics, well, if they did any studying about it, they'd realize that what they're promoting is economically destructive. And so I think a lot of the problem is a lack of understanding. Is what, if we all had perfect understanding, we'd all agree perfectly, right? And so whenever there's a disagreement, I think it typically has to relate to the fact that somebody doesn't know what they're talking about. But you know, my thinking for us as Christians is that we don't have to. If we're wise, we don't put ourselves out there in regards to global warming or economic. That shouldn't be our. I've got an opinion about global warming, but I don't need to talk about that a lot because I can't do anything about it, and so it diminishes my influence on others because they may differ with me about global warming. That's okay. They can differ with me about global warming because what I really want to talk to them about is God. Yeah. So yeah, I think you're right. But I do think the reason why people can be so adamant in 180-degree different opinions is somebody's not got proper understanding. Anybody else? All right. So we'll have to go at this pretty quickly. He says, list 5 sins of the tongue. And then he gives us 5 passages to consider. 1 Timothy 5:13. We'll go through this real fast. 1 Timothy 5:13. Withal, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but tattlers also and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. So tattlers and busybodies are identified with speaking things they ought not. 1 Timothy 3:11. 1 Timothy 3:11. Even so must their wives be grave, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. Slandering is a sin of the tongue. Ephesians 4, verse 25. Ephesians 4:25 says, wherefore putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. So lying is a sin of the tongue. That's a really common sin of the tongue these days, I think. Ephesians 5, verse 4 says, neither filthiness nor foolish talking nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. Filthiness, foolish talking, jesting. How would you? I'll just take just a real quick a minute on that. What would be some examples of filthiness, foolish talking, and jesting? Anybody? I don't want to do that, obviously. It's condemned here. What would be some things that would fall in that category? Anybody?
Dirty jokes.
Dirty jokes? Anything else? I think that's right. You know, a lot of times, people will say things but they kind of intentionally have a darker double meaning to it, and so all that kind of talk that conveys immoral things, foolish jesting, and then James 5, verse 24. James 5:12. Above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath, but let your yea be yea and your nay, nay, lest you fall into condemnation. There's a kind of an important question here that we could talk about, and we're not going to do it this morning. We've talked about it before. We don't have time to talk about it this morning. We could talk about judicial oaths, because sometimes that verse comes to play. When you go into court of law, put your hand on the Bible. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help me God, is the expression they want you to repeat. We could talk about that. That's an important, interesting question, I think. But here, what he's clearly talking about is false oaths or false swearing, that, you say one thing and you purposefully are saying something that you don't mean. So false swearing, or again, effectively lying. So a lot of sins of the tongue. We could talk more about that. So how do you guard yourself against all those kinds of sins of the tongue? Proverbs 13:3. Proverbs 13:3. He that keepeth his mouth keepeth his life, but he that openeth wide his lips shall have destruction. Okay, right there's the answer. So all those and we had to go quickly through that list of different kinds of things, sins that you can commit with your tongue. How do you avoid all that? Well, the easiest way to avoid all that is keep your mouth shut, right? We definitely need to realize that sins of the tongue are easy to commit, and we need to be on guard about that. I don't think as Christians we see as much carefulness or caution as there should be. I'm not saying I'm sinless in that regard either, but I am made aware from time to time of people saying things that ought not to be said, falling in the category of some of those things that we listed just a minute ago. They'd just be better off to keep their mouth shut, and need to do that. One of the things, look at James chapter 1 verse 19. James chapter 1 verse 19 says, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath." One of the things that really helps us all, and I would include myself in this for sure, one of the things that keeps us from committing those sins of the tongue is don't be so quick to say something. Slow down. When you speak without thinking, then you're much more prone to get yourself in trouble. Way better to slow down. Measure your words before you say them. Think about how that might impact the other person. If I say that, how often have you, I got to tell you, I've done it way too often. How often have you said something and then you look over and you see it, oh man, I didn't think about that person being here, and they've been dealing with that very thing. And so I got to be careful. Slow to speak. Make sure what you say is right and in the right tone and in the right scenario. Slow to speak. We're going to avoid a lot of trouble. And I think, as our lesson is suggesting, we're going to be considered a wiser person if we're just slow to speak and less prone. We're all going to say some things from time to time that should not be said, but we're going to be less prone to do that if we're slow to speak. Thoughts or comments here, anybody?
A phrase that I keep in mind, especially when I'm dealing with employees and things like that, is you can't unring a bell.
I think that's right.
And so I always try to think before I speak, because sometimes even if I'm addressing something, I say directly to them, they may take that information and give it to 20 or 30 other people.
Yeah.
The next thing you know, I've endorsed something company-wide that
Yeah.
wasn't
Yeah.
what we're doing. So I have to be really thoughtful about anything that I say, because it is people.
I think that's really a good observation. And I think of that expression too. You can't unring a bell. Once you said it, I'm sorry. No, okay, you're sorry, but you already said it. And the person you said it to is not going to forget it, and very, very likely may tell others that you said it, and not tell the other part that you apologized for it later. So I think that all goes to the idea of be slow to speak. Other thoughts here? Anybody? Okay. Job 38. So the question asks, when is the tongue particularly a dangerous member of our body? Job 38, verse 2. Remember, we talked about this, and I think I mentioned it in the lesson last Sunday. Job had been provoked. He had suffered horribly. And he had been provoked by some supposed friends who came to him and offered him miserable counsel. They were wrong. They were accusing him of things that weren't true. And he was just back and forth. And they were we would use the expression, they were wearing him out with the things they were saying to him and about him. And so under their provocation, Job actually began to say a few things concerning God, accusing God, saying some things, blaming God for some of the horrible things that had happened. And so, chapter 38, verse 1, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" God said, "Who is this been saying this stuff?" And he's looking at Job, right? He knows it's Job. And then he goes on to say, "Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding." And then it goes on for 2 chapters where he just keeps posing questions. Where were you? Who did this? And of course, he's just talking to Job. So Job realized that he had spoken out of turn, and he confessed that in chapter 40, verse 4. "Behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth." And Job said, I said too much already. I was talking, didn't know what I was talking about. I'm going to put my hand on my mouth. Well, that's the idea. He realized he had said too much. He had spoken without understanding. And he would have been a lot better off then and now. Just keep his mouth shut, right? And that's the principle that our lesson is describing this morning. Proverbs 18. Proverbs 18, verse 13. "He that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him." You ever get yourself in a situation, I know you have, where somebody comes to you and they convey a situation. They tell you, what do we say? They tell you their side of the story. And you know what? It's very tempting to just jump on that and immediately assume that what was just told you is the perfect, accurate representation of the matter. We need to be wise enough to realize there's always another side to the story, right? If there's some kind of interpersonal conflict going on, you can hear one side of the story, but don't answer until you find the other side of the story. Right? There's always 2 sides to a story. And so in regard to our lesson this morning, you will do better, I will do better, if you just reserve judgment and certainly spare your words, because there's going to be some more information here that I don't have yet. Right? And so to answer a matter before you hear it, I would actually add the adjective there. To answer a matter before you hear it fully, it is folly and shame unto him. And I think that's the idea here. So kind of keep your mouth tight and shut. That's not saying you couldn't respond to the person who's talking to you, but don't form judgment and don't take sides, so to speak, until you've heard the full matter. I think we can all probably relate to that, because that's a common experience. Anybody? Thoughts? All right. Proverbs 26. Proverbs 26, verse 3. This is a curious passage. We've talked. It's been a long time since we've talked, but I remember one time maybe even bringing a lesson on these verses. Proverbs 26, verse 3, "A whip for the horse, and a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit." Well, the way most versions, I'm reading the King James Version here, that sounds like a direct contradiction, one verse right after another. And so you have to think, surely that's not intended to be contradictory. Surely that wouldn't be one statement followed by another that immediately contradicts the first, surely there's got to be some understanding, and I think there is. I believe that verse 4, answer not a fool according to his folly, is don't engage him in tit for tat. Don't engage him at his same level. You know, this guy's saying some crazy, outrageous things. Don't answer him back in a crazy, outrageous way. But verse 5, I like the way the New American Standard translates verse 5. It says, answer a fool as his folly deserves, lest he be wise in his own conceit. And so, you know, when a foolish person says something outrageous, that needs to be addressed, because if nobody corrects him, he's going to think he's pretty smart. He's going to think he's very wise. And you don't want him to, you want him to know that what he just said is wrong. So his statement, his foolish statement deserves a response. Don't engage him at his level. Don't engage him in ridiculousness, but correct the statement that he's made. James?
I've heard it explained in verse 4 that this is like an ongoing debate that's just never ending, and so you're never going to win. Verse 5 says you answer him, but verse 4 is like, if he won't listen to you and it's just going to go back and forth and there's no reason to continue the debate, you stop, because it's fruitless in that way. It's in perfect tense, they say in verse 4. So it's just this ongoing thing that will last forever.
Yeah.
So stop.
You're not getting anywhere. Yeah. So don't just keep engaging him. You're not getting him. You're not convincing him. But on the other hand, you don't let some false, erroneous statement stand. You correct him and you're done.
And then if he won't listen, you're not going to just keep after it.
Yeah. I think that's a good explanation. Anybody else? All right.
I look at it, I read it a little differently. First, I don't think a fool's going to listen to counsel like you say to counsel him. And I'm reading it like if you engage him and go down that path with him, then he's going to consider himself wise because you're going along right there looking to engage him there.
I think I understand what you're saying. You know, we sometimes use expression, you don't have to get in the mud and waller with the pig, you know. So if I engage him, and like James was saying, if I engage him just in this ongoing back and forth and he's not listening anyway, then
It's going to legitimize
yeah.
you're giving him that time.
Right. And so I think, as James was explaining, verse 4 suggests don't engage him in an ongoing tit for tat. But verse 5 actually tells us, make it plain that you don't agree, and here's the actual truth of the matter. So verse 4 is sort of don't engage in an ongoing tit for tat. Verse 5 says, correct him so that he knows that you know that what he said is not true. So it's kind of a challenging statement. There's got to be some explanation of it, or else we got a direct contradiction one verse to the next. So I think that's the right way to view it. But again, all of that goes to the idea of really be careful with your words. And even in a given situation, there's a right way and a wrong way to deal with people and situations. And you got to be really careful with your words. All right, go to James chapter 3. We're not going to read all of this. He suggests James 3, 1 through 12. I would just point out verse 2. James 3, verse 2. How hard is this business about controlling the tongue? James 3, verse 2. For in many things we offend all. If any man offend not in word, the same as a perfect man, and able also to bridle the whole body. I think James is saying your hardest job is to not sin with your mouth. If you're able to control yourself in such a fashion that you never sin with your mouth, you have really achieved a level of spiritual maturity. And that's what the word perfect there means. Obviously, nobody's perfect, but the word perfect there means complete or mature. And so I believe James is saying our biggest challenge is going to be not saying things we shouldn't say, being careful not to commit sins of the tongue. If we can control our tongue, then we can probably control everything else we got to control too. I think that's the idea of that. Going over, still in that chapter then, go down to verse 8. The tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, even which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be, or so to be. Does a fountain send forth at the same place sweet water and bitter? Can the fig tree, my brethren, bear olive berries, either a vine figs? So can no fountain both yield salt water and fresh. What do you think it means there? Out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. We bless God and we curse men. What's the cursing there? Anybody? Well, I think the first thing that comes to our mind, right, is cuss words. You know, we cuss a guy out, and then we praise God out of the same mouth. You know, which is that probably would be a fitting thought, but I'm not sure that's what he means here. To curse men is to call down something bad upon them, to wish them ill. Is the idea of cursing there. We talked a while back about the word imprecate. There are some psalms that are called the imprecatory psalms, to call down a curse on someone. And the idea is to try to state anyway that you want something bad to happen to somebody. And so that's the gist of this. If I do that sort of thing, I'm demonstrating that I'm lacking knowledge. That's what he says. How is such a thing ready evidence that the speaker must be a fool? I think it's because obviously I'm not thinking about the long-term implications of that. I get mad at you and I say something horrible, you know. You maybe even use cuss words to express it, but to wish you ill, you know. In the long term, that's not going to be to the purpose that I really want to achieve, right? In the long term, that's not going to be good. I don't want a bad thing to happen to this person. I want this person's soul to be saved. And so, you know, I'm obviously not wise to engage a person like that, which would be totally counterproductive to what I should really want for such a person, right? So we ought to think along that lines. Anybody? All right. Let's see here. All right, let's go on to question 7 if you're looking at your study guide. How can the tongue be used wisely according to Proverbs 15, 1 and 2? Proverbs 15, 1 and 2. A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Again, my thinking is that we can all relate to that. And we've probably been in that situation. I absolutely confess that I have been guilty of escalating a matter by my response to things that people have said. I've tried to learn better. I'm not perfect at that. I confess freely I'm not perfect at that. But over time, I've come to understand, and I think the principle of this verse is here. You know, if I've done something bad, or if I've done something wrong, or if I've offended someone, it's way easier to simply say, hey, I'm sorry, I was wrong, I shouldn't have done that, versus trying to justify what I said. You know, I may feel like, you know, I could engage in an argument here to justify my actions. I'm going to tell this person, I'm going to tell them right to their face, and I'm going to defend myself and justify myself to the hilt. And I've got to, as I said, I confess to you, I've done that too many times in the past. But I think the right approach, and I've tried to learn this, and I've actually seen it works better, to simply say, hey, I'm sorry. I said something there I shouldn't have said. Please forgive me. You know, a soft answer. I had somebody come to me just not too long ago and just read me out. I can tell you. I mean, this person read me out royally. And I think it was a woman, and I think she was looking for a fight. And she was, I think, taken aback when I said, listen, I didn't handle that right. I'm sorry. If I could do that over again, I wouldn't do it that way. And it just sort of, it just took the fire out, or took the wind out of her sails. And I don't think that situation, I don't think that relationship is ever going to be good. But I was, in that instance, I've not always been wise, but in that instance, I think I followed the principle of this proverb: a soft answer turneth away wrath. It could have gotten ugly. And actually, I think she was wrong and I was right. If you want to know the truth, I think she was wrong and I was right. But there wasn't any use engaging at that level. And I could have handled the situation better. And so just to admit that and say, I'm sorry, I could have done better. I wouldn't do it that way if I had it to do over again. And that sort of diffused the situation. And I think that's the principle of the psalm here, or the proverb rather. Anybody? I'm not asking for anybody to relate unpleasant circumstances, but I think probably all of us have been in situations like that where somebody just can't. You know, we even talk about, she got right up in my face, talking about somebody who really let you have it verbally. Usually in those kind of situations, if you respond in kind, it's not going to be productive. It's not going to be helpful. And it's better to just give a soft answer and turn away that situation. All right. There's a really powerful statement about the example of Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. Even hereunto were ye called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that ye should follow in his steps. So Jesus left an example, follow his steps. Now the next verse. Who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. So Jesus, perfect example in everything, right? But verse 23, when he was reviled, he reviled not again. So I think this is clearly talking about the time frame relative to his crucifixion. And so when the riotous mob came to the Garden of Gethsemane and took him, you know, they were hurling insults and ugly things toward him all the way back into town. When they did that mock trial and accused him so they could crucify him, it says when he was reviled, he reviled not again. What they were doing was wrong. Obviously, Jesus was perfect. Everything they were saying, every negative thing they were saying about him was wrong. But he did not engage them at that level. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. And so that's, I think, a very powerful example from our Lord and Savior. I remember reading a bulletin article years ago. Some of you remember the name Robert Turner. Robert Turner was a Texas preacher, very well known, did a lot of meeting work, but also put out a really great bulletin that we all loved for so many years. He called Plain Talk. His bulletin was called Plain Talk, came out once a month. Well, I remember a bulletin article that Robert Turner wrote, and he said when he was a young preacher, someone had come at him and sent him an ugly letter and said some stuff that shouldn't have been said. Well, he sat down at his typewriter and he was composing a powerful fire back right at him, you know. But he was just a young preacher, and he said one of the elders of the church came in, and Robert Turner explained to him what was going on. And he said, this elder said, Robert, we're not dogs. We don't have to bark back every time somebody barks at us. and he said he tore the letter up and went on. And, you know, I've tried to remember that expression. We're not dogs. We don't have to bark back every time somebody barks. If people are going to bark at you, yeah, you don't have to bark back. You know, and sometimes it's just so much better just to, when you revile not again. like Jesus did. So I think that's really an important principle for us to make application of. Proverbs 26 verse 17. Proverbs 26:17, he that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears. As a madman who casteth firebrands, arrows, and death, so is the man that deceiveth his neighbor and saith, am not I in sport? Where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. But where there is no where there is no talebearer, strife ceaseth. As coals are to burning coals and wood to fire, so is a contentious man to kindle strife. The words of the talebearer are as wounds. They go down into the innermost parts of the belly. Burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered with silver dross. Okay, so I think, again, some very familiar but also really important statements. Don't meddle in business that is not your own. He that passeth by and meddleth with strife belonging not to him is like one that taketh a dog by the ears. You don't take a dog by the ears typically, because they don't like that, and they'll probably bite you back. You know, some things are just not any of our business, and you don't need to be involved. In fact, you'd be better off to stay completely out of that. It's not your business. Again, that's kind of a hard life lesson to learn, but I think as we get older, we begin to see the wisdom of that. You know, how often have we stuck our nose in where it didn't belong, and you know, just it got a bad result because of it. If it's not, you know, for us as Christians, I think we understand the caveat of that. If sin is involved, if we got a brother or sister that's engaging in sinful activity, then we're actually mandated to address that, right? So, you know, that we understand that side of this equation. But there's a principle here. If it's something that's not any of your business and you don't need to be involved, don't get involved. You don't need that. And it probably won't be helpful to you or anybody else. So I think that's the principle set forth there. I like verse 20, where no wood is, the fire goeth out. So, even so, where there is no talebearer, the strife ceaseth. You know, this thing would have been over long ago if we didn't have this one person who keeps poking the beehive. If we didn't have this one person who keeps throwing wood on the fire. If this one person would keep their mouth quiet, this thing would go away, but they don't. The words of a talebearer are as wounds. They go down into the innermost part of the body. You know, it's really hurtful. Somebody attacking you verbally, that's really a hurtful thing, very hurtful. So anyway, you can cause strife, and you can continue strife. You can cause and continue strife by saying things that you shouldn't say. Keep your mouth shut. You'll be considered wise if you don't engage. You know, as our lesson is titled, how does better to remain silent be thought a fool than to open one mouth and remove all doubt? I think that all of these passages that we're looking at today kind of confirm that is a truism. Not a Bible quote, as we said, but it expresses a truth. What's the best thing to do when you don't know what to say? You know, that ought to be an obvious answer to us, right? But how often have we been, you know, I don't know what to say, so I just start running off at the mouth. And if I do that, because again, I'm not measuring my words, I'm not thinking about it, I'm just going to get myself in trouble. If I don't know what to say, I need to keep my mouth shut. Proverbs 29:11. A fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it in till afterwards. I don't know what to say. Okay, then don't say anything. I mean, that just makes sense, doesn't it? A little bit more obscure verse here, but I think it states the same truth. Amos 5, verse 13. Amos 5:13 says, therefore the prudent shall keep silence in that time, for it is an evil time. There's times you just need to be still. And then a familiar verse in the New Testament, Colossians 4. Colossians 4 verse 6, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man. You know, we ought to use words like we use salt to season our food. A little bit's good. Some's good. Without it, it's not good. You know, so we need to. There's some things we need to say. But man, you put too much salt on your food and you just ruin it, right? So use your words like you use salt. A little when needed, but the danger, the big danger is saying too much, right? Use your words like you would use salt. And then finally, one last passage, and we're just out of time. 1 Peter 3, you know this text. 1 Peter 3, especially verse 15. 1 Peter 3:15, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. Be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you the reason of the hope that's in you with meekness and fear. So when it comes to spiritual things, we need to be ready to give an answer. In other words, so it's not right to keep quiet when it involves truth and righteousness. In matters of truth and righteousness, be ready to give an answer. To give an answer there is from the Greek word apologia. The word apologetics come from it. To make a defense, really, it's the idea of like defending a position in a court of law. Is the idea of give an answer. But be ready. Be ready to make a defense for what you believe and what you understand the truth to be. But importantly, do it with the right attitude, with meekness and fear. Meekness, strength under control, fear, proper reverence and respect. So be ready to give an answer, but do it with the right attitude. All right. Any final thoughts, anybody? I tell you what, I think there's a principle here that we can all work at, because I believe I can say with absolute certainty none of us is perfect here yet, right? None of us have achieved perfection in that. And so we can certainly work on controlling our tongues. Thanks, everybody.